Well, good morning to you, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted and pleased to be here. And I'm at a stage now where every day I wake up, I'm pleased to have another day, but I also discover various disabilities. My knee and I are not getting on well at the moment. So while I'm thinking about my knee, of course, I'm taking my mind off other disabilities which I had last week. So, as I said, I'm very pleased to be back here again because in my past, I did spend some years here previously, and I have got very fond memories of the place, and I still do with various colleagues that I work with at the moment. Now, what I'm going to present to you this morning, in fact, is part of a larger study that I did that I've been doing for 4 or 5 years, and it's looking at what people bring with them into mental health care. Now, I'm not thinking about problems and diagnoses and symptoms and things like that, but what beliefs do they have? What expectations do they have? What do they think is going to happen? What do they think is the end point? And equally, of course, I'm trying to look as well as what do the staff think they're providing. So it's a belief milieu that I'm looking at, and I'm trying to make sense of that. So what I'm presenting is a small part of that bigger study. And that bigger study, in fact, was the City 128 project that you might have read about in the past. But it was published very widely across the world, in fact. And it did feed into the policies here. But of course, healthcare policy doesn't stand still for very long at the moment. So by way of preamble to what I've got to say, I just want to start by having a few reflections when I was preparing myself for today. And one of the things we are learning a great deal about is ourselves, the human condition. And we have shifted from a belief, a classic traditional belief that human nature was fixed, was static. All we had to study was the nature of being, not necessarily becoming. But of course all that has changed now. Human nature is dynamic. We are flexible, we are changeable. We do respond and react to circumstances and contexts in which we find ourselves. And that the end point for each of us is negotiable. It's not fixed. For each of us we decide what the end point is. We're learning also that people who are ill and in need of care and treatment view such notions as illness, risk, health, and lifestyle very differently from those who provide health services. We're also learning about the importance of faith and belief in the maintenance of health and in recovery from illness, and how the two are so closely linked. I'm surprised that I've got through my clinical career, my management career, my teaching career, my research career, without giving it much thought. But it's now that I'm winding into retirement that I actually have spent a great deal of time trying to examine what do I actually believe. And it was something I rarely asked my colleagues when I was working with them. Do you believe something similar to me? Could we talk about beliefs? We didn't do it. So that's why I was quite interested really when the introduction was being presented this morning, that you are a community of inquirers, creating a community of scholarship, a community of enlightenment. And one of the things I think that you look at is, what do you actually believe you're doing? Seems confrontational, but it also is extremely basic. So I'm not talking as such about belief and faith in a religious faith, though for some people that is extremely important. It can be faith in oneself, faith in family, in friendship, in community, in goodness, and public service. That is why it is important to reflect from time to time on what our patients, our service users, our colleagues, and ourselves actually believe. Now, something I've been reading recently, and something I was very forcibly struck by, and I just thought I'd bring it along to you this morning. I've been reading Simon Gray. Some of you might have come across him. He was the man who lived a very neurotic life. He drank a lot and he smoked a lot. And towards the end of his life, he wondered why he was so neurotic and why he smoked a lot and why he drank a lot. But he made a career out of it because you've read his books, have you? The Smoking Diaries and this book that I'm going to quote from, The Last Cigarette. And it was interesting, I think, his reflections on his own health and the fact you don't understand me unless you understand my neurosis. I come as a package. Whereas in mental health, we're trying to take things away from people a lot of the times, rather than seeing what it is that people, why they believe and behave in certain ways. So here he is talking in the Smoking Diaries, published in 2008. I think he died about last year, was it? Okay. Here he is talking about his experiences of the various people he met. While professionals themselves may be benevolent and altruistic, frequently their behavior and words can be incomprehensible, insensitive, fatuous, or even plain cruel. At the very least, many of their routine assumptions and ways of relating to ordinary members of the public can, especially when those people are bound up with their own sense of chaos, doom, and misery, seem simply bewildering. A little reflection there, and you know, when I used to go down to my unit up in Stafford, I'd bring things like this down to the patients, and we'd sit and say, what do you think this person is writing about? A person like yourselves, what do you think he's talking about? So all sickness and disability necessitates some form of explanation and interpretation. And much medical anthropology and healthcare social sciences emphasize that staff, patients, and service users are all meaning seekers. And this is central to the concept of recovery in mental health. Every mental health assessment should be far more than a symptom inventory. It needs to be, whenever possible, an inquiry into meaning. It is now abundantly clear that mental health professionals and carers need to understand the beliefs a person holds and how they affect a person's life in health and illness. We need to remind ourselves from time to time that care giving, care sharing, and care receiving are some of the most sacred, skilled, compassionate, and humane acts that one human being can do for another. Now, but having said that, and having listened to the introduction this morning, we are in a pretty cold, calculating financial climate. To do healthcare good and well, it takes time. It is a highly valuable resource. Does that appear in your business plans? Does it appear in the commissioning plans? My invitation to you is that it should. It needs a special place, a highly valuable resource. And I never cease to be amazed when I do various visits to places for various purposes, the awful situations in which mental health care is delivered. And yet we have the essence of care about privacy, confidentiality. I need to speak to you privately. I need to speak to you about things I haven't talked about before. It requires caring people who are brought on, nurtured, and believed in. The old adage, being with those who help my being, is terribly important. And again, we need to be with people who value hope, who value belief, and who value the future. When I was preparing this, just a few people struck me, and I'll just give you a few quotes before I get into my study. And Diderot, one of the great writers in the French Revolution, of which mental health, I believe, actually came from, stated in 1746, what one believes in is true, even though you cannot prove it. And the number of times I've heard patients and staff say to me, I actually believe it. I've no evidence for it, but I believe it. This is the case. Now, what happens if that is out of kilter with the belief of the organization? And Vershkow, 1929, belief begins where science leaves off and ends where science begins. quite profound. And Ederman, drugs are not always necessary. Belief in recovery always is. And then Cousins more recently, to believe something while knowing it cannot be proved yet is essential to physics. So that is by way of my preamble into what I'm going to present to you. And you watch now how I do this. And at this point I'm going to shout, "Nurse! Andrew! Help!" Yeah.
It's already open. Don't forget to left click it.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Now you can see what I see. Good. Right. So I entitled this Service Users' Beliefs about Acute Inpatient Care. And that's where a lot of the academic interest is taking place. A lot of people are sitting in the department at the moment saying, what is acute mental health care? What is it? Does it have to be in inpatient settings? If it is in outpatient settings, what are these settings like? And of course, because the question is that more and more what we used to call acute is ongoing, problematic, or long-term. It's based on a paper which was published a few months ago. This is the paper, Service Users' Belief about Inpatient Care. And I'm just going to scan through it and present the bones of what we found in that. So there are the people involved with this bit of the study. That was Eleanor Bradley and Neil Brimblecombe. And that's the journal that we published it in. Now, the aims of the study was to try and identify the beliefs that service users hold about being admitted to acute care. That was the link, the beliefs they have about being admitted. And then to see if we could explore something about the relationship of these beliefs to how they behave once they've been admitted. Now, I'm just going to scan very quickly through the literature. I've done it in more detail in the paper. But again, the literature is telling us, and the literature into loads of these mental health studies are all more or less saying the same thing. Beliefs exercise more control over behavior than any other factor. And again, beliefs are derived from experiences, cultural, personal, social, and spiritual. There's an enormous amount of socialization and enculturation has gone into what we actually believe in. Individuals interpret experiences very differently. And it's so trite to say, and yet so powerful that you can spend time with students, staff, and patients and go through similar things and yet end up with very, very different end results. And of course, again, experiencing mental health care settings requires being exposed to multiple realities and multiple discourses. Now, that is coming out mainly from the social sciences at the moment, the impact of hearing yourself discussed by different professionals. Quite profound and quite interesting is that. Acute care settings are complex environments because there's not one thing going on, there's several things going on. And a very, very powerful piece that I remember being influenced many, many years ago was the piece by Jocelyn Handy, and it was on the anthropology of nurses in acute wards. I don't know whether you've come across it or not, but that was a very, very interesting paper. Again, making sense of the experience is demanding for some. What is actually going on here? I'm sure you have heard it time and again. And it's said to me every time I go, what is going on here? What am I here for? And following 3 or 4 weeks, the patient at a meeting that I was at turned around to the consultant and said, "Doctor, when is the treatment starting?" The doctor said, "I've been receiving it, have I? Well, why didn't anybody tell me I was receiving it? Or what is the treatment?" "Well, you've been having CBT." "That's what it called it, is it? I thought I was having a chat." So I was having treatment. Yeah, so we're not awfully good at explaining to people what's actually happening. And again, 1/3 of admissions, I'm sure that's going up, are unnecessary. And again, if you look at the context, in our bigger cohort here, we had 600 patients, 1/3 of whom were admitted between the hours of 12 midnight and 6 in the morning. 1/3, when of course all the other services had closed down. when we had the most inexperienced medical staff gatekeeping. Some of them, in fact, weren't terribly clever with English, so goodness knows why they were admitted. So there's big areas of questioning there as to what was transpiring. And of course, when we tracked the medical staff down, they were taking the line of least resistance. In other words, we're not going to take a risk and send people home in case they kill themselves. So who actually decides to admit, and what were the other choices offered? Now again, entering care can in fact challenge one's identity, because inside acute care, just like inside acute medicine, we're exchanging identities. We're turning people into patients and we're giving them reasons and rationale for it. Again, the patients or service users are turning people into nurses and finding out how are they behaving within these roles. So there's all sorts of identity checking, identity changing, identity challenging going on. And of course, again, being given new identities, particularly those that I can't cope with. And this is diagnosis can be quite disabling and profound for people. Staff can appear to be a community of believers, as the patient said to me time and time again. There's no point in discussing anything here because the staff believe in what they're doing. There's no room for doubt. They all believe that the end result should be so-and-so. And again, expressions of doubt or questioning or uncertainty seems to be a criticism of staff, so I tend to avoid that. And again, many hypotheses are being tested, and the final one that they came back to time and time again, the greatest need, and the greatest challenge, and the greatest success I can find is, am I understood? Is what I'm saying, is what I'm talking about actually accepted and understood? So here was the methodology that we had for this section. We looked at 4 wards. It's one trust. It's the South Staffs and Shropshire Trust. That's where I'm linked in with. And there were 2 in Stafford, 1 in Burton and 1 in Tamworth. And the potential, so it went on for 8 months, and that was some funding we had over from the bigger study, so I used it to bring in a nurse to work with me for about 8 months. So the potential respondents approached to participate had been on the ward for approximately 2 weeks, and we checked with the staff to make sure that they were all right to talk in a research mode. And you'll find out later that not all of them were very suspicious of research, or many of these service users. So we had 49% rate, agreed, 44, 18 males, 26 females, and the mean age was 41. So we had an interview schedule, and 17-item non-standardized interview schedule, specially designed to elicit beliefs held prior to admission. Now I'll come back to this again. It seems awfully trite, and what I'd invite you to do is asking a person what they believe in is a profoundly loaded question to which people haven't reflected and thought about. So the responses, in fact, I think, I forced them into an hour's interview. I think the best people to do this would be clinical staff or practice staff who are working with people who could talk to them over a period of time. Because I think you need to talk through or talk people into what they actually believe. What did beliefs consist of? And I hope I'll present these to you. What are the effects of holding these beliefs, and how could you explore these beliefs? Now, I have oodles of criticisms, as I'm sure you will be, when I've stopped my presentation. Now, before we get on to that, I want to look at the refusals, and I want to make sure that you take these into account. 54 people refused to participate, and 40 of those gave reasons. And the reasons I categorized as follows. The usual response was, I'm not well enough to participate in research. I came here for treatment and care, so I don't want. So if everybody adopts that attitude, where do we get our experience from? I don't believe in research. That came up time and time again. Research does not help me. So that's the challenge back to you. How do you make it more acceptable? How do you make it more usable to the staff you're working with and the service users that you're attempting to help? It's only for staff. There are no effective treatments in mental health. And as you'll see from when I look at the participants later on, you're inclined to think, bloody hell, are these actually inside the health service? 33 admissions. rather a lot, isn't it? Don't know what is required. So you've explained the protocol to them, what we're going to do. They said, no, I can't talk about belief. I don't know how to talk about these things. I've never talked about it. And if you ask me questions, I wouldn't know what to say. And anyway, I have been part of research before, and nothing seems to improve. Now here are the participants. And the 44, 22 had no previous admissions, so this was their first admission. And then you can go down through it. 5 had 1, 8, 2, 4, 4, 2, 8, 1, 15, 1, 27, and 1, 33. And this lady who had 33 admissions, she was utterly bemused, confused about what the whole experience was about. And I did say it when I was presenting this back to the staff, you have a very bewildered person here. So you need to take time out to see what it is that she's presenting to you, rather than saying, here's so-and-so, she's been readmitted before, let's readmit her again. And that sort of traditional routinized way of thinking is pretty rife in mental health, which needs to be challenged, and you could do it. Now, procedural issues, there was a pilot, and we tried to refine the instrument we were using. The ward staff were informed. Despite the fact we did lots of research projects with them, it is interesting how it's just a few that actually genuinely take an interest that they act on. The vast majority will say, well, what's in it for me? Is it going to take me away from, is it doing additional to what I would normally do? But I did detect in medical staff, OT staff, even in psychology staff and nursing staff, a great theme of indifference. So that's something I think you need to work on, but perhaps it's different around here. Ethical permission was sought and obtained. Regular meetings held to update staff and service users about what was happening, and the findings were discussed at various stages along the way. And I think that's terribly important as well, as I've been doing research for years, is to feed it back to the people that you're working with, to tell them what is coming out and get people to discuss, and it helps you to understand it as well. Now the findings, you remember what the aims were, the findings. And they fell into 3 categories. There were those who held positive beliefs, and by that I mean they were quite favourable about being admitted. There were those who held negative beliefs, they were unfavourable, and then there were those who were nonchalant. They were neutral or they were uncertain about what was happening. Now here are some of the themes that came out under these headings. The positive beliefs. Admission was the best option. Unquestionable. It was the best thing at that particular time. Now, with a few of these respondents, I actually had time to explore what the best thing was. And I'm not awfully sure it's what you think it is. And I'm not awfully sure it was the best thing for many of them. But they saw it as the best thing. They were being relieved, they were being reprieved, they were being taken out of a context. Responsibility was being taken away from them, and they felt that they were handing themselves over to others. Staff were seen as essentially good. I found that quite extraordinary, going to see people in units or wards, how you can have a mix of patients, and some will say these staff are fantastic, and others will say, honestly, they look as if they should be in a concentration camp. Rule keeping, shouting, it's all our fault. How the experience and how the environment can be interpreted in very different ways by different mindsets. Well, that was my preamble to you. Would feel safe. The quickest way to get appropriate help is better than seeing a GP. So if you're sensitive at the point of admission, you hear a great commentary of how the pathway, how people got to be there, and the various experiences or impressions they form about agencies along the way. And there was also a belief that they would get well. Now, do you remember one of the bits I said in my preamble is a belief in getting well is terribly important. And inside the recovery philosophy, if you don't hold the belief that you will get well, well, recovery is an illusion. And again, it provided respite for the family. Now, that came up quite a few times, though it fell to the bottom in the hierarchy of things. Admitting me in here relieves my family. Now here are the negative ones, the ones that came straight out with it. I don't want to be here, I don't need to be here, I don't believe it, and I'm here against my will. Admission was seen as the worst possible option. Now the vast majority of these were not on sections, so it is interesting how people can go along with things that isn't in their best interest and yet accept it. And it's quite extraordinary, is that. And that's Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance, that I can do one thing and believe something else. It confirmed I could not cope. No alternative offered or suggested. And again, presumably if these people are being admitted after hours or during the night time, there isn't any other service available at that particular time. Hadn't been helped on previous admissions. And again, that kept up with the people who had over 8 admissions would often say, well, the previous admissions are a good indicator of what will happen this time. Nothing really much came out of the last admission, so why should it happen this time? Admissions equated with stigmatization entailed loss of self-worth, and it also signified I was beyond self-help, and they believed they would never be well again. Now, I did sense that those who were inside the negative camp, they had no shortage of explanations and reasons for holding negative feelings. Is that all right? Okay, the reason I make that point is that I'm going to conclude by saying that you as therapists or as nurses, can you actually challenge these beliefs? Because it appears to be that many of these respondents never had their beliefs challenged. They just went with them from one admission to another. Here are the ones who were uncertain, unsure about what was actually happening to them. They didn't understand what admission meant. Now, I was assured by the medical staff and the nursing staff that explanations were given. Well, of course, that doesn't mean that they were received. And if they were received, it doesn't mean they were understood. And if they were understood, it doesn't mean that what transpired subsequent to the admission was actually in line with what was said to them. So there's whole lines of inquiry there, all getting jumbled up. They didn't understand what was being offered. It's like the patient who said, when is the treatment starting? And they'd be told, well, the treatment has started. Oh, gosh. So I've been treated without me knowing it. Good Lord. What was being offered was exaggerated. There is no health service in the world, said quite a few respondents, who could provide what that doctor on that evening said would happen to me. I'd have access to a multiplicity of services and people of my choice and of my choosing. That never materialized. Was unable to decide what was best. Even if I was offered choices, I didn't know at that particular time what was in my best interest, and did not wish to be with other service users. Now that's a theme that cropped up time and time again. Now 18 months ago I had my hip done. Gosh, I'm abusing you really by telling you of all my complaints. Had my hip done. And I was in a ward up in North Staffs, not Mid Staffs, because of the I had to put my foot on the accelerator every time I went past Mid-Staffs in case I got MRSA, yes. And it was all hips. So we were a hip community. It was all hip talk. And we could talk and challenge each other, and one day I'd be the doctor and they'd be the patient, and I'd be the patient the next day. And then we had a knee. A knee came in. There was no knee talk. They were the odd one out, yes. So, and again, if you look at acute admission wards, what an amalgam of people that are there with backgrounds, diagnoses, problems, etc., etc. So here we are hearing it from service users that going into an acute ward is being exposed to a mixture of people, confusing, making the environment complex, making it very difficult to be heard, and would only provide short-term help, and I had to wait to be told what was going to happen next. So can you see how all this is building up in the minds of people, and it is causing them bewilderment. And of course it is calling out, in fact, for, please, how do you help people like this? And how can you call it treatment if people aren't clear about why they're having treatment or where it's going? Now I want to bring it to some conclusions. That's the body of what I want to get across to you. There were, in fact, very different beliefs about why people became mentally unwell. Not only that, but people changed their belief on each admission. The purpose of admission, again, as to what it meant, did change, what to expect, what the end point was. Aftercare never seems to be mentioned, what was going to happen afterwards, and their own ability to cope on discharge was rarely talked about. Even if people appear to comply, it does not mean they agree and understand. Now that is that's a very, very profound finding from this. And I'd like the staff that I come into contact with to take this more seriously. What they are experiencing may be at odds with what is taking place around them. Patients would say, yes, I talked to the psychologist, I talked to the doctor, I talked to the nurses, but I'm not awfully sure that the talk is amounting to anything. I'm no more reassured at the end of it. I'm no more clear about how I'm going and how I'm doing and where I'm going. Where people cannot find information, they tend to resort to believe in what they think is happening. Service users see staff as preferring compliance and acceptance, and what is said depends on who you are speaking to. Now, do beliefs change during the course of admission? I'm not too sure, and that's something I would like to explore. Are some deeply held and others not? That's something I'd like to explore. I'd also like to explore, in the presence of some staff, is it easier to examine my beliefs than in the presence of others? Now, I would say the answer to that is yes, but I'd like to follow that up in more depth. Are beliefs open to change? And is that the role of nurses? Who should be challenging beliefs? Who should be trying to understand them? Is it too intrusive to ask people what they believe? Is it ethical to attempt to help people change their beliefs? The beliefs that people hold are no guarantee of outcome. That again is quite a significant. So many people did want to get well, but didn't. Now how do you begin to explain that in terms that they would understand? And people do opt for admissions knowing it does not help them. Right, that's my end. But I've got a few more points to make before I finish. How am I doing for time? Am I all right? Yeah. So I just want to stand back from that and ask myself a few questions, having done it. What does it mean for me? What does it mean for the teams that I go down to see? What do I want to convey to the staff, either through friendship, through education, through clinical practice? But more importantly, what do I wish to say to the service users who come to us for services that we're trying to improve what we do? We think about it, we try to better it. And more importantly, what am I going to say to our commissioners who come back next year and say, where's the evidence that what you're doing is any good? Well, at the moment, that isn't terribly impressive. And I think we need to ask more probing questions of what it is we're providing with a view to try to improve what we're doing. Taking stock of who we are and what we do and the effect we have on others is a vitally important part of being a caring professional. Are we clear about the outcomes we are trying to bring about? And if so, why are so many nurses engaged in activities that have no nursing outcome? Whatever beliefs service users hold, we would like to think they believe in themselves, in what is being provided for them, and who believe that the future holds out all sorts of possibilities for them. I believe that many service users do require help in assessing their beliefs, understanding them, testing them, challenging them, and if required, abandoning them. To free people from life-limiting, self-denying, future-negating beliefs and assisting in replacing them with life-affirming beliefs is getting people to see that human nature is not fixed nor static. It is open, it is endless. are we able to create caring cultures and environments where we can examine our own beliefs with each other so that we are clear about the values and beliefs we hold? Do we believe that it is through sensitive, genuine, honest, informed, respectful, hopeful, and skilled engagements with others that the real essence of the NHS is expressed and experienced? You know as well as I do that there are many patients, service users, that through encounters with various professionals and carers have had the most significant life-enhancing experiences due to their beliefs and those that they have acquired. And I just want to finish with the old adage: to live is to change, and to live well is to have changed often. Thank you very much for listening to me. Sure, yes. Am I within time, right?
I've got time for questions if anyone would like to ask.
Hello. Thank you very much for such a stimulating and enlightening presentation.
Yes.
A lot of findings you presented were in line with sort of what we've done 2 years ago. And I find it really, really amusing that we hear we did all these things, but again, as a researcher, as practitioner, we keep doing the same thing. To me, the main important issues came across was really communication issues, and how, as practitioners, we're still not communicating enough with our clients, customers, patients. But again, really, you highlight a very important point about time. In our research, we actually looked and talked to both commissioners, clinicians, and the users. And we tried really to feed in what the users said. And the response we used to get was from the practitioners: we don't have time. So that I found it really interesting.
Yeah. Just, it's very interesting to hear you speak. Can you tell me, from the research that you do, how do you talk to yourself about it? Is it a reason to say, well, we need to look at the type of research we do, we need to look at the type of organisations into which we expect our research to be utilised and valued and respected? Or is there something about the wider culture of healthcare that somehow we don't understand? I mean, there's 3 options, but perhaps there are others. But I'd just like to hear you just reflect on those for a moment.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because when we were doing this piece of work, the whole idea was to evaluate mental health service from the user's perspective. But what my sort of policy was, as it really is really doing research to impact policy and bring changes about. Hence, really, we utilize this approach, not talking only to the patients or users or carers, but actually checking it out, you know, doing 360 degree research, so everybody knows what is happening, with a view really to be able to come up with some sort of solutions.
Yes, yeah.
So really, that is sort
yes,
of the
yeah.
approach
I think that's terribly important. And it is something that requires understanding, that having said it, it's one of these things that it reverberates around in your head. Just as the patients and service users are finding acute care contexts very complex, very difficult places to negotiate and be in, and to find out what the purpose of this is for me, and to get people to talk in specifics to me rather than in generalities and abstractions. I think that healthcare systems in which people work are very complex. There's a lot of noise. And it's a bit like that came out of the mid-staffs inquiry, you know, that it's the old adage that if a bedpan drops in Stafford, it reverberates through Whitehall. You know, people are saying, stop, who's making all that noise? It's a very complex organisation. Who's in charge? Who's calling the shots? Who is calling the quality assurance issues? Who is talking about the quality of care? Who is it? Now, I think that's very complex, because the commissioners are saying one thing, and that's why I'm saying to you, you want to get across the fact that you can only do your jobs well providing the commissioners commission quality context in which you can deliver quality care. The other thing is, I do think we need to know much more. We probably know it at a theoretical level, but we need to know it at a practice level, a practical level. How do we turn some of this research into practice? Now, I've told you in my way that I try and talk to the staff, I try and talk to the service users together and a separate, I've got all the professionals in. I think I'm making sense. I think they're all nodding in agreement with me. And then I go back some time later, and it might as well have been that we didn't talk at all. Now, there's other voices that these people are hearing. There's other tramrails that they're holding on to. There's other directives that they're holding on to. And I think it is confusing. I'll just tell you this story to show you how confusing the place is. I was in Luxembourg recently because one of the students I've got is Luxembourgish, I think that's how you pronounce it. And she was very keen to set up home treatment in Luxembourg. Now, I've no idea what the heck they were trying to do, but they called it home treatment. And while I was there, the medical superintendent was very keen to impress me. Don't quite know why me, and I'm not easy to impress. So I said, well, I'm sure, medical superintendent, that's the job you should be doing. You know, there's no reason why I should be telling you how good you are at it. The problem arose in the Department of Health that the medical staff were overpaid for what they were doing. Not uncommon, but they said it. So what they said was, rather than paying you for the amount of patients you have on your case load, we will pay you for the number of patients you admit and that you see through back to home. You got it? Right. Seems very simple, seems very reasonable, not awfully clever. It's written up in all the management journals as this sort of thing. What do you think the Luxembourgish doctors did? Our salaries are going to be cut, right? Now's our opportunity. We'll discharge them before they're ready and have to readmit them. And what has happened to the readmission rate? It has upped. Now, how do you explain that context? These were not evil people, I believe. They were playing a system. They were playing it to their own advantage. They were playing it to their own interest. When did patient care and patient efficacy and patient welfare come to the top? It was self-interest which drove these people. Not only that, the nurses and the psychologists were looking on and watching it happening, and they knew precisely what was happening. Now, I was very, very disturbed by all of that. And yet, in the neck of the woods where I walk and I see similar practices going on. Professional self-interest, protecting my turf, making sure that how I do things and how I see things are not challenged. Yes, everybody else should change, but not me. So there's a lot of vested interest, I think, in healthcare in preserving the status quo. And that is terribly, terribly frustrating to people like you and to people like me who said, well, we do believe that we could try and improve things through research, and as you introduced it, getting it into the curriculum, getting it into our consciousness, getting it into our practice, and trying to improve it. And I think, inside from a research point of view, I think I could make the world a better place for service users. I think I could. The problem is, not everybody else agrees. Okay, I haven't talked myself into a conclusion other than the complexity of the environment in which we're trying to do research and then implement it is probably more problematic than we actually are able to conceive of. Is that all right?
One last quick question? No? No? Oh.
Did you have any inclusion or exclusion criteria?
Well, the exclusion criteria were people who were so distraught or distressed or so psychiatrically ill that it would be an unfair question to put to people. There were a number of people who didn't speak English because that's a part of the world where you had a lot of farm labourers coming in from Eastern Europe and who were, this was the first tranche of becoming mentally ill. It would be unfair to ask them to participate. And there were probably a few people, not many, there was only about a dozen, that the staff felt that to talk to strangers such as myself who was coming in might be seen as a bit stressful or might be seen as them being interrogated. So we excluded them on those grounds. And the reasons we excluded them was we did it in conjunction with the staff, that we respected the staff and their decisions as to who ought to be included and who should be excluded.
As a result of that, did you have 22, the 22 who only had first submissions, do you think that has an effect on your findings?
I do. That's a very, very good question, very perceptive question is that. I think this is probably a pilot for other things. I would like to differentiate first-timers from those who had multiple admissions. I'd also like to divide males from females, because I think I was beginning to discern. I didn't actually put this into the paper, but when I was doing it quietly at home, I discerned a difference in how males were responding to how females were responding. And of course, in mental health, there are gender differences anyway as to how people perceive health and how they perceive health and how they look forward to the notion of going home. These are heavily gendered concepts in mental health. But that's a very interesting question, and I think the 22 would be very interesting to look at by themselves and to see what was it. Now, not all 22, they fell into the three categories. Some of these were indifferent, some of them were negative, some of them were positive. But just to see, could you identify what was it in their pasts, what was it in their socialization that led them to this belief? Now, I know in other studies we did, particularly the 128, of course, people coming into mental health services were yesterday members of the public, so the influences that they get from the media, the television, neighbours, the police, reporters, etc., they're open to the same influences that you and I are open to. But as to which ones they select, which ones they choose, and where this negativity comes from, I mean, I find that intriguing. And that's why I just couldn't get at it in this stuff, because I'd be there all day, really, and all week. That's why I'd hand it back to clinical staff that are here to try and say that'd be an interesting project to look at, but you'd need to do it, you'd need to do it in a grounded, ethnographical way to say, let's look at beliefs over a period of time.
Thank you.